Hello and welcome. My name is Rachel Bronson, and I'm the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, an organization that focuses on man-made threats to humanity, including nuclear risk, climate change, and new disruptive technologies. As some of you might know, I served in a variety of leadership roles here at the Chicago Council from 2006 to 2015. Thank you to everyone for joining us for this program. With the 2021 UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, scheduled to begin next week, we're discussing how we can achieve meaningful collective action on climate change, despite the persistent ideological divisions and lack of consensus that often surrounds the issue. Before we get started, by means of a disclaimer, please note that the Chicago Council on Global Affairs is an independent and nonpartisan organization and takes no institutional positions. Views expressed by participants on the program are their own. They're my views, they're Katharine's views. If you have a question you'd like to ask, we'll be taking live audience questions in about 30 minutes via ccga.live. Simply enter ccga.live into your browser, follow the on-screen prompts, and you'll be able to submit your question and upvote them, so I'll be able to take them towards the end of the program. With that said, I'd like to welcome and introduce today's guest. Katharine Hayhoe is the Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservancy, as well as a distinguished professor in the Department of Political Science at Texas Tech University, where she also serves as a political science endowed chair in public policy, public law, and as an associate in the public health program of the Graduate School of Biomedical Scientists. She is the author of a new book, Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World. And a link to purchase the book will be circulated in the YouTube chat feature throughout the program. I've just finished the book, and I can tell you, I'm recommending it to anyone who will listen. It's one of the easiest to read, most deeply knowledgeable books I've come across, and is packed with solutions that you and I can consider to actually begin to make a difference. I am not joking. This is a great Christmas present, a great birthday present, pretty much for anyone in your life. I highly recommend it. I want to share with you that I've been following Katharine's career as a fan for some time. My first introduction to the important role that evangelical Christians can play in the fight against climate change began here at the Chicago Council, when I helped direct a task force on the future of energy that included evangelical leader Richard Cizik, who spoke about the responsibility to God's green earth at the time. Among Katharine's many affiliations, she serves as the climate ambassador to the World Evangelical Alliance, an alliance that represents 600 million people around the world. And the climate scientists on the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists Science and Security Board, my current organization, speak so highly of her work and regularly speak of Katharine as one of the most effective, persuasive, and responsible climate communicators of our times. So we are in for a treat, I expect, today. Katharine, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Rachel. It is great to speak with you today. And I have admired the work that you and your organization do for so long, because the greatest threat to the future of our civilization literally is us. And you bring attention to that very effectively. If we didn't know that, I think we'd be in a very different place today.
Well, thank you. So let's start the conversation, I think probably with an easy question. Why did you write this book? Why did you write Saving Us?
I wrote the book because the number one question that I have gotten from almost anyone I've spoken to of any age, anywhere, the last 5 years is simply this: what gives you hope? And then the next question I get is, how do I talk about this to my family member, my colleagues, my neighbors, people I know? How do I have a conversation about something that weighs so heavily on my heart? 70% of us in the United States are already worried about climate change, and those numbers are greater in Canada, the UK, Europe, and beyond. How do I have a conversation about something that I'm really worried about, but I'm afraid will either end in an argument or will just make me even more depressed than when I began? So I wrote this book to answer those two questions. And although the book sort of looks like it's about climate change, so to speak, the icing or the window dressing is climate change, what it's really about is how can we all get along and how can we all work towards a better future together?
That's a perfect segue into the next question that I want to ask, which is, I love how you start the book with a focus on COVID. It's an unexpected place to start a book so focused on climate. You seem to use it both in recognizing that COVID right now is front and center in many people's minds, and so you have a sense that that's what's on people's minds, so you don't skirt around it. But you use it to illustrate the polarized moment that we're in. So can you talk about how the polarization around COVID was familiar to you as a climate scientist, and why you started there, and the segue?
I felt like, how could I not? Writing a book during COVID, watching how a purely scientific and medical issue became rapidly just as politically polarized as climate change. And one of my favorite cartoons, so to speak, in terms of Black humor, is a cartoon that shows two medical professionals standing there with clipboards saying, surely if we just tell the American people the facts, and then behind them you see two climate scientists rolling on the ground laughing. Like, yeah, that's what we've been trying for decades, and look how that's going. So there are so many parallels between our response to COVID and our response to climate change, and so many lessons to be learned from both.
Well, picking up on that, I know in other talks, you've also talked about a cartoon with tsunamis coming. And so maybe you could lay that out for the audience, but also how it compares, like what we're talking about with COVID and climate. We don't need to get into a competition on disasters, but there is a sense of proportion that we're living through, but also how we should be thinking about climate. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. The cartoon you refer to looks at a city, and then there's this tsunami coming towards the city that says COVID. And then there's a little bit of a bigger tsunami behind it that says the economic crisis. And then behind it, there's a giant tsunami that's labeled climate change. COVID and climate change are both threat multipliers. In other words, they expose the fractures and the flaws in our society, and they magnify problems of inequity, injustice, poverty, hunger, lack of access to basic education and basic health care. All of these issues have been thrown into sharp relief during COVID, and climate change is similarly an even greater threat multiplier, to the point where we cannot fix what is wrong with the world. We cannot achieve the very basic United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of no poverty, no hunger, basic education, access to clean water and sanitation for all. We cannot achieve these if we leave climate change out of the picture. If we look at the numbers, here's just two horrifying numbers. So the economic impacts of COVID are measured in the trillions of dollars. But the economic impacts of climate change, unchecked, could be up to $1 quadrillion. COVID so far has been responsible for over 4.8 million premature deaths. And every premature death is a tragedy. I know people who've lost their lives, and you probably do too. But every single year, air pollution from burning fossil fuels is responsible for nearly 9 million deaths per year. Every year. So indeed, COVID is a crisis, but right behind it is looming an even bigger crisis, that of climate change. And if we don't fix it, it will fix us.
It's such a daunting challenge. We'll get to what we can do, because this is a very big part of it. But before we get there, let's just talk a little bit about a COP that's coming up, the climate conference, because it's in the title of our presentation today. It explains the timing of why we're meeting. How important are these, is COP and these kind of big global convenings to addressing climate change? And then maybe what are you going to be looking for? You've been there, you're watching it, central to your research in terms of what's happening there. So how important are they, and what are you looking for?
They are very important, and it's not because of climate. It's because the way we humans operate we need deadlines. We need opportunities to get together and see how what we're contributing measures up compared to all the other different countries. So these climate conferences are very important for us because they provide an opportunity and an impetus and a motivation for countries to up their contributions. because these meetings are like nothing more than a global potluck. And that's what I talk about in the book, where all the different countries in the world have contributed, or have promised, I should say, to keep warming below at least 2 degrees Celsius and below 1.5 degrees if we can. And then they all have their individually determined national contributions or their potluck dishes to bring to the table. So one country decides to invest in reforestation and restoration of degraded ecosystems to take up carbon from the air. Another one might go all in on efficiency or clean energy or vehicle standards. Still others might put a price on carbon, like my home country of Canada. Each country has a dish that they bring to the table in COP. And all the other countries put their dishes on the table too. And up comes the country with the big apple pie. You cut into it. It's full of hot air. Along comes another country that just dragged a single fish finger out of the back of the freezer. That doesn't look so good. And then a country shows up with a big fresh salad full of veggies and homemade dressing. They're doing their part. So that's why COPs are so important, is because it focuses the attention of the world on the contribution that each country is making. But I want to emphasize it's not only about countries. It is not only up to the presidents and prime ministers of the world to save us. It is up to all of us. In some sense, actually in many senses, companies, corporations, even cities have more influence than some individual countries. All of us are part of a system, whether it is a company, a big NGO, a city or a state or a province where we live, a church or a faith-based organization or community organization like the Rotary Club or the Lions or the Kiwanis Club. No matter who we are, we're part of organization systems that are greater than ourselves. And within each one of those, we have a responsibility to use our voice to advocate for change within our sphere of influence, because it literally is up to all of us to fix this.
Can I pick up on cities? Only because the Chicago Council actually has a big initiative on cities, and they're thinking a lot about the role that cities can and do play. And certainly over the last several years, there's been a lot of attention that at the federal level in the US, where very little action was taking, the petri dishes, the experiments were taking place at the city level. I was struck in your book that you use Chicago as an example too. It's my hometown, so I paid particular attention to it. Can you talk about the role that cities play in all of this, and maybe with some reference to Chicago? I know it's a global audience listening to this, but I'm sitting here, so I'm interested.
Absolutely. So I am certainly biased. I'm a University of Illinois graduate myself, and I worked on the Chicago Climate Action Plan a number of years ago. Cities are very powerful because they have high concentrations of people living in a relatively small geographic area. Cities are uniquely vulnerable to climate impacts. During heat waves, the urban heat island effect exacerbates the heat wave. When heavy rainfall comes, the risk of flooding is greater if you have large paved areas of impervious pavement. Cities also tend to have poor air quality, and they can also be very vulnerable to resource scarcity because they need a lot of water and a lot of energy to supply for all the people there. So cities are uniquely vulnerable, but they also have a unique ability to act on climate, because often a lot of the initiatives that will legitimately cut our carbon emissions and change our lifestyles can be done at the city level. Bike lanes, carpooling, public transportation, efficiency standards and incentives, building codes. All of these changes can be done at the city level. And so cities have a tremendous power to take action in a way that federal governments might often take years to do. A city can get it done quickly. So the city of Chicago, when we started working with the city, we started not with what the science says about climate change. We started with what concerns the city had. And we listened as the Chicago Transit Authority talked about how some of the rails on the Metro Trail, the light rail transit, warp when it gets too hot. They have to shut down the train and bus people, and it's very expensive and disruptive. The city also talked about how certain underpasses tend to flood and how they're really worried that the Great Lakes levels might drop, sending water into the Great Lakes rather than down the Chicago River. They talked about how the famous summer festivals that Chicago has, when it's really hot and humid, people can't show up for them. And Chicago is very concerned about the future of its trees because it knows that climate is changing very quickly, and it wants to make sure that all of the trees and parks are prepared. And then there's the energy costs for the school board and the buildings. All of those are affected by climate change. And then there's the fact that back in 2011, Farmers Insurance actually sued the city of Chicago and Cook County for failing to prepare for the impacts of climate change in terms of flood risk and leaving insurance companies to pick up the tab. So begin the conversation with what is already a concern. Chicago doesn't need to talk about hurricanes or wildfires, but they absolutely need to talk about heavy rainfall and heat and water supply and things like that. So once we looked at those, we then said, well, how do we expect these to change in the future? Depending on the choices that we make as humans. If we continue on our current pathway of depending on fossil fuels, or if we transition off to clean energy. And you might say, well, Chicago's only one city, so why does it matter what Chicago does? Chicago might have a footprint of 6 or 7 million people, but Chicago has a shadow that can stretch across the world. As one of the biggest cities in the United States and one of the biggest cities around the world, Chicago can influence other cities and be an example for other cities. And so, just among the many things that the city's doing, they realized that heat waves were a serious concern. There were 2 very serious heat waves back in the 1990s that were responsible for hundreds of deaths within the city alone. And they know that the urban heat island effect adds to the risk. So you already have a situation where cities are warmer than the surrounding area, and then you put a heat wave on top, and that can be a crisis. So they said, all right, what if we could lower the average temperature of the city by the same amount that climate change is pushing it up? How? Through green roofs, through planting more trees in green spaces, through planting trees that are currently native to southern Illinois. Why? Because when they reach maturity, they'll be native to Chicago's climate. So that's just one example of how the city can take concrete action that improves air quality, because trees filter out the air pollution, that reduce the urban heat island effect, so immediately help people, especially in low-income neighborhoods that were historically redlined due to very racist business and insurance and mortgage practices. Those areas tend to be 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter during a heat wave than the more wealthy areas of the city. So green spaces, parks, reducing the urban heat island effect, especially in low-income neighborhoods. Oh, and those trees take up carbon too. It's a win-win-win.
You spend a lot of time in your book kind of on this theme about long shadows and trying to talk about that individual action matters and how that ladders up. And the example that I have in my mind is the person trying to figure out how to engage in faith communities. And you had to roll them back to say, like, focus on the communities where you might have a difference. And he couldn't figure out what that was, and you helped get him there. Can you talk about that? Because that's one of the Chicago Council, just, I think, associated with this program, put out some polling to show that generationally, there's actually a pretty, a growing consensus that we should care about climate change and that it's directly impacting us. It's a threat, and it's not a generational difference per se. It might be ideological, but not generational, which was surprising. But you spent a lot of time thinking about, like, how do we unpack that? Where are places? You talk about your experience in the Rotary Club as well. Could you share some of that? It's a big part of your book, so I think it's worth talking about.
It is. So we can have the biggest influence in communities where we have something in common with people. And all of us are embedded in multiple communities. So I encourage people in the book to take an inventory of who you are and what you love and what organizations you're part of. You might be an avid birder, or you might sail, or you might love tennis or wine or food or beer. You might be a parent. You could be involved with your kids' school. You might be part of a faith community or a neighborhood or a community organization. Whoever we are more than just a single individual through our connections with other people. And so when we're looking to start a conversation on climate change, that provides the best place to start. From the heart rather than from the head, with something that we share with somebody else. I talk about how one of my colleagues is a climate scientist. He's an ice hockey player. Another one is an online gamer. They start conversations with people in those communities and connect the dots to how climate change affects them. All too often, we want to go after the toughest nuts. We want to go after those 7% who are dismissive, who say it's a hoax and are constantly posting on social media or bringing it up every time we run into them in the driveway or at our family dinner. But those 7%, the dismissives as they're called, they are the ones who cannot be convinced. I feel like it takes a miracle to convince them, and I personally am not in the miracle business. But the good news is 93% of us were not dismissive, and 70% of us were worried. But 50% of us feel helpless and hopeless when it comes to climate change. So the biggest problems we have cannot be addressed by dumping more scary facts on people. The biggest problems we have are that we don't understand how it matters to us here and now, and we don't understand what we can do about it. So when we talk about it, those are the two things to focus on: why it matters based on what we share and what we have in common, and what are solutions that are being done by our city, or by an organization or a company like ours, or a school like ours, or what am I doing in my personal life that I could talk about and share. I was just on Twitter earlier today and someone said, well, there's one easy thing everybody could do, which is bike to work. And I said, well, depending on where you live, that is something that some people can do, but don't forget the most important part: talk about it. Talk about why you're doing it, how you do it, encourage somebody else to join you, use your voice. That's how change becomes contagious.
It's so interesting what you said. You said again, you're a scientist, and you're saying, like, don't dump facts on people, right? It's really hard not to, because you feel like, well, if you just know the facts. But you talk about phenomenon like psychological distance and solutions aversions. Can you talk a little bit about those vis-a-vis the facts, how you reconcile your role as a scientist and your role as a communicator, and how you put those together?
Yes. So don't get me wrong. Of course, the facts are important because they explain the way that the world works. Someone can say, I don't believe in gravity, but if they step off the cliff, they're going down. And someone can say, I don't believe what a thermometer tells us, but it's getting warmer no matter what you believe. So the facts clearly explain that climate is changing and humans are responsible and the impacts are serious and the time to act is now. But most of us are not suffering from a lack of facts. Most of us know that the Arctic is warming, that Antarctica is melting, that polar bears are endangered. You'd have to be living under a rock these days not to know those things. The biggest problem that we have is not a lack of dire headlines. It's that we don't think it matters to us, which is psychological distance, and we don't think there's any way to fix it, which is solution aversion. We agree, most people in the United States agree, that climate change will affect plants and animals, non-human species, far away from us in terms of relevance. We agree that it will affect future generations far away from us in time. We agree it will affect developing countries far away from us in space. But when you say, do you think it will affect you? Most of us say no. And if we don't think it affects us, why would we ever want to fix it? Especially when so much of the solutions are deliberately messaged to turn us off. I have literally seen tweets on social media saying, President Biden wants to take away your hamburger and your car. I've literally seen that. I have seen people say, well, Bernie Sanders said that the only thing to do was to abort all the babies and that's how to fix climate change. I have literally seen people claim that. And so it's no surprise that people feel like climate solutions are all about loss, losing everything that makes our life worthwhile, we think. And so we push back. In reality, of course, what we stand to lose if we don't fix climate change is everything. Everything. We cannot float around in outer space with the economy next to us. It is based on the resources this planet provides, and so is our civilization. As the title of the book says, it's not about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. It is about saving us. Everything we most value is at risk. And once we make that connection, we can talk about what real solutions look like clean energy that cleans up our air and our water and cuts our carbon emissions. Efficiency that saves us money and could cut carbon emissions in the US by 50%. Nature-based solutions where we restore and invest in conserving nature, coastal wetlands, mangroves, forests, grasslands, and more. It cleans up our air, it cleans up our water, it provides habitat for animals. Oh, and it soaks up our carbon too. There's so many positive, constructive solutions that when you ask people about the real solutions, people are like, of course, yes, that sounds wonderful. But we have so much discussion going around in the media today that is deliberately intended to introduce solution aversion and to discourage people from really getting on board with this issue.
So I'm looking at the questions that are being posed, and I think there's one that's directly on this, so I want to jump to it. The question says, should we talk more about the monetary cost to mobilizing people, higher utility prices, higher food costs, higher insurance premiums? And I would add on to that question too, the cost of making the change as well, right? So some of the things you talk about, it's all the things we need to do, they sound great, but there's costs, right? There's certain people benefit and other people don't, or you have to make investments now for things we'll see in the future. Can you talk about costs in this, both what mobilizes people, just higher food prices mobilize people, and then the cost of change?
Well, there's a bit of a straw man in that question because although short term the cost can be higher, longer term they are definitely not. For example, one University of California, Berkeley study found that if the whole US power grid transitioned to clean energy plus storage by 2030, we'd end up saving money. It would be a net positive. There are a lot of other climate solutions that grow jobs and do end up saving money. Not to mention the fact that how do you put a dollar value on nearly 9 million lives lost every year prematurely due to climate change? That question highlighted something that I've been mulling over. This isn't in the book, it's just a new thought I've had. We need to take the Marie Kondo approach. So her approach is, so you have a closet and you're trying to clear out your closet. Rather than going through and saying, okay, this pair of pants, this sweater, this jacket, I could take these out. She says, no, clear the whole thing out and then only put back in what you can save, what you want to keep. If we don't fix climate change, how much will it cost us? Everything. Our entire closet will be bare. There will be nothing left if we don't fix climate change. It's not about saving the planet again. It's about us and our economy. So instead of saying, how much will it cost to get there? Talk about, okay, if we stand to lose everything, how much is it worth to save that? And it reminds me of this wonderful book of 60 women's voices on climate change that was published last year called All We Can Save. We are looking at this the wrong way around. We have to recognize that what's at stake is everything, and what are we willing to pay today to benefit from financially and health-wise tomorrow as well, don't get me wrong, in order to save all that we can tomorrow.
And picking and looping back to the questioner too, is high prices, will that motivate people? Going back to all the work you've done on what motivates individual to make their change, and maybe you can also talk about some of the things that you do, because towards the end of the book, you said you take on 2 new changes a year or something like that. And so maybe talk us through that, because you say in your book, as a climate scientist, that difference isn't going to radically alter the future, yet you take those changes anyway. So a couple things in there, like what motivates change, and then why do you do what you do?
What motivates us to change is a sense of efficacy. The idea that if I do something, can it make a difference? And so often we might be trying to do everything we can in our personal lives, and then we just get discouraged. We feel like it hasn't made any difference. I don't see anything happening out there in the world. I have no hope. Why bother? Why not just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, so to speak? But we're missing the crucial step, the only step that has ever changed the world before in our modern industrialized society. That step is to use our voice. To use our voice to talk about change. That is how it becomes truly contagious. And when we look back at how slavery ended, how apartheid ended, how civil rights became enshrined in law, how women got the vote, when we look back at the ways that our society has changed before, it was not because a president woke up one morning and decided it had to. It was not because a famous or rich person decided to completely redo their way of life that was unjust and profiting from the misery of many. It was because very ordinary people decided the world could and should be different. They made the changes they could in their personal life, but that wasn't what impacted the world. What impacted the world was when they used their voice to talk about why it mattered and what we can do to fix it, working together, all of us together. And eventually it happened.
Catherine, I think that's so important in terms of what drives change, because I hear it certainly all the time, right? Like, especially on issues of nuclear weapons, but climate change too, is like politicians in the national capital, they're the ones, ultimately the big changes have to come from there. There's very little that we can do about it. And I think politicians will often as certainly national ones, feed into that, right? Like they'll take care of it and they'll fix it.
Mhm.
At the same time, we know repeatedly they say that they're a bit hamstrung because there's no popular sentiment to do what they want to do. When pushed on it, they will admit that change comes because their voters, certainly here in the States or Canada or elsewhere, like their voters are pushing them to do something, that they're being represented. And I think especially as we talk about COP, and there's a question that I want to come back to on COP, but especially as we talk about that it all matters. Of course, what national leaders do matter, but they've got to feel that their feet are on fire, staying with what we're talking about, to actually make big, hard decisions as well. And so I think what you're saying in terms of voice is just so important. Let me just flip to this COP question, because I do want to make sure we don't lose it. It came in early, and it was, what do you think global leaders should prioritize at COP26? So you talked about the potluck, everyone bringing something, but should we be thinking about finance and how we finance this? Should we be thinking about reductions? Or how should we be prioritizing this? And what would look like what would you check mark off as, oh, that was a success. That was what I hoped for, or more than I hoped for.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, it would be a success if we had enough dishes on the table, enough mitigation commitments to reach our Paris goals in terms of limiting global warming to below 2 degrees and 1.5 if we can. But there's another half to it. And the other half is the fact that the 3.5 billion poorest people in the world have contributed only 7% of global emissions, yet they are bearing the brunt of the impacts. And so in the Green Climate Fund, all of the wealthy countries that had produced most of the world's emissions, the United States is responsible for 30% of global carbon cumulative emissions since the dawn of the industrial era, 30%. They promised to contribute to a fund to help low-income countries mitigate and adapt. So reduce their carbon emissions and prepare for the impacts that they could no longer avoid. Well, there was just a very, very damning analysis that was published in Nature magazine just today, and I posted on my LinkedIn page if anybody's interested. The United States has only contributed 20% of what it promised to that fund. Canada has contributed 40%. Norway is the only country that's contributed 100% of what it promised. So that is the other part of this, is that climate change is profoundly unfair and unjust. Those who have contributed the least to it are bearing the brunt of the impacts, and that is true in low-income neighborhoods right here in Chicago or in Houston or all across North America, but it's also very much true in terms of the dichotomy between economies. Since the 1960s, climate change has increased the economic gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world by as much as 25%, and that is not fair.
The issue of fairness, too, is one of the things that drove you into this field. Isn't that right? You had the story of the Rotarians when you redo your talk to address one of their principles of fairness. Do you want to share that story? Because it's important, again, as we think about addressing it.
Absolutely. So you're right. That's what made me become a climate scientist, when I realized that climate change was not only an environmental issue like I had always thought it to be, that environmentalists work on and environmentalists take care of and the rest of us wish them well. When I learned that climate change was so profoundly unfair, that it affects the poorest and most marginalized people more than anyone, that's when I decided I had to do everything I could to help fix this problem. So a number of years ago, I was speaking to our local Rotary Club. And, I always say we have to begin our conversations with something we have in common. So because they were local, I figured I would start by talking about our crazy weather here in Texas and how it's getting even crazier. And have you noticed what's happening? Because most people have. But I walked into the hotel ballroom where they were having the lunch, and there was this giant 4 or 5 foot banner with the 4-way test for the Rotary Club. And at the very top, it said, "Is it fair?" And I thought, no, climate change is absolutely not fair. And then it said, is it the truth? Yes, of course. Or I'm sorry, is it the truth was first. Is it the truth? Yes, it is the truth. We've really checked over 200 years, and it is true. Would it be beneficial to all? Would it build goodwill and better friendships? Climate action absolutely would be beneficial for all, especially the poorest and most vulnerable and most marginalized. And it would definitely build better friendships among people who traditionally haven't been great friends. So I skipped the lunch and I went over to the corner of the ballroom and I reorganized my whole talk into, is it the truth? Is it fair? Is it beneficial? Would it build goodwill? And I gave the 4-way test on climate change. And so as I started, I could see from the body language of most people that they were not too sure why they'd invited this climate scientist to speak. There was a lot of sort of folded arms and people sort of leaning back a bit. But as I started to go through the 4-way test, the arms unfolded and people's bodies moved forward and they started to nod because they recognized their values. And I was applying their test to climate action. And I will never forget, and I tell this in the book, how a local banker came up to me afterwards with the most bemused look on his face you've ever seen. And he said, I never used to think too much of this whole global warming thing, which is the very polite Texan way of saying I thought it was a load of crap. But it passed the 4-way test. Sort of, what can I do? It passed. Therefore, as a Rotarian, I must care. And I just felt like, wow, if we could end every conversation like that, that would just be amazing. And unfortunately, most people don't walk around with a 4-foot banner of the rules that, that they apply to make decisions. But through listening to each other, through asking questions, through learning more about each other, we can find out what makes people tick. We can find out what their values and priorities are. And then we can start the conversation with something we genuinely agree on and share. And that's where constructive conversations begin.
It segues right into a question that's been voted up, which is how do we shift the conversation to a more positive one when engaging with people that are dismissive or skeptical of climate change? How can we prevent the usual partisan pitfalls? You've already touched on some of this, but it gives you an opportunity to dive a little deeper into it.
Yes, absolutely. So only 7% of us are actually truly dismissive about climate change, 7%. But those 7% are very loud and very vocal. They're on social media. It's your next door neighbor, your, brother-in-law, old college roommate. They are absolutely convinced this thing is a hoax. And like I said, nothing will change their mind. So with those 7%, there really is not a lot of benefit to engaging because they're not even going to listen to what you say. They literally cannot listen. If you give them a link online, they cannot click on it. I've tried. I've experimented a few hundred times. They can't click. If you say something to them in person, they can't hear what you just said. Their ears are closed. Their eyes are closed because they're so convinced that there's no solution that works for them. That's the problem. But with 93% of us, we're not dismissive. We might be doubtful. We might be cautious. We might have questions. But if we can begin the conversation again with something we agree on, rather than something we disagree on, if we can begin from the heart rather than the head, if we can end with positive, constructive, beneficial steps that we can take, rather than a load of doom and gloom that just makes us more depressed than we were at the beginning, that's where we can start to change the world. And if you don't know what to say, if you don't know how to start the conversation, as I talk about in my book, get to know them first. As individuals or as a group of people, whatever it is or whoever it is, get to know them first. Figure out what's important to them, and then always look for something positive that you can bring up. Did you know? Did you know the city of Chicago has a climate action plan? Did you know that Texas gets 23% of its energy from wind and solar energy? Did you know that last year during COVID, 90% of new energy installed around the world was clean energy? Did you know that food waste is a huge part of the problem? And by not wasting so much of our own personal food, by signing up for one of those programs where you get the ugly fruit from the grocery stores, you can actually be part of the solution. Really? Yes, it can totally be contagious. But we have to always make sure that we're starting where people are at and that we're providing something tangible that increases people's sense of efficacy to show them how they can be part of the solution, which always, always, always involves talking about it.
Katharine, there's, just as you were talking about that too, there's such lessons from COVID, right? And in why people are fearful of vaccines. And we kind of started with just people being anti-vaxxers, and everyone was an anti-vaxxer who didn't get it. And then slowly, as we've tried to figure out our public health response, certainly mandates were necessary for some, but there was some people were wait and see. Some people had very good reason not to trust the public health system, marginalized community, women included. The medical system has not been great in kind of testing vaccines on us before going to mass dosing and everything like that. And it's been really interesting to watch the newscasts on this as we've begun to understand there's actually a whole lot of different reasons people may be skeptical, concern, questioning about inoculations and vaccines and different strategies of who to trust and local leaders and how we get into communities. There's something in this, and there's something very similar to your approach to climate, which is there's reasons people are skeptical. They can't figure out what the solution is, don't feel that they have agency in it. Maybe they've been taught that or whatever. It's political and ideological, and trying to break this down kind of community by community, person by person, to figure out how to have the conversation. Back to what you were saying before, it's bigger than COVID and climate, right? It's how to engage in a politically fraught moment. But there's so many lessons. It just struck me of what you were saying about what we're seeing in vaccines and everything that are very similar.
100%. Absolutely. And what's the common denominator? Us. It's how we humans respond to threats that can be well characterized and even addressed by science. Yet our ideology, our identities get tangled up in those facts to the point where sometimes we don't know what's up or down.
So we have time at least for one and maybe two, and hopefully we can get to two, but let me get to one that was upvoted the highest. Can you speak to how your identity as a Christian folds into your advocacy for combating climate change?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's a great question. So remember I mentioned earlier that one of the best ways for us to start is to do an inventory of who we are, what we love, what makes us tick, what motivates us to act and to care about things. And for me personally, a big part of why I care is because I am a Christian. I believe that, well, I don't believe, I know that the Bible literally says that we are to love others and be recognized by our love for others. And how loving is it if we just close our ears and our eyes to the suffering that's already happening in this world due to poverty and hunger, injustice, and more, that climate change is exacerbating or making worse every day? So I'm to a large extent driven by my faith, and this is not unique to the Christian faith. Every major world religion has traditions of stewardship or caring for nature or creation and caring for those less fortunate than us. And as I talk about in the book, many of my colleagues are humanists, and they care for the same reasons. They care because it affects people, and it's not right and it's not fair. So start with who you are and reach out to others who share that with you. And today, there are many, many on that stage. You started off by mentioning Rich Cizik, who was an early leader in speaking out about climate change from an evangelical Christian perspective in the US. Well, today, we've got Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, over 20,000 young people around the whole country who are advocating for clean energy standards in every state, as well as at the federal level. We've got the Evangelical Environmental Network. We've got the Catholic Climate Covenant. We've got the Church of England and the Church of Ireland divesting from fossil fuels. We've got so many different initiatives across all ranges of faiths that are stepping out and speaking out on this. And so it's a great place to start the conversation. If you're Catholic, with the Pope's encyclical. If you're Orthodox, with what the Patriarch Bartholomew says about climate change. If you're Episcopal or Anglican, with what the Episcopal or Anglican Church says. But as I talk about in my book, if you're not a person of faith, if that's not a community that's a big part of your life, then that's not the best place for you to start the conversation because you're different. So a couple of times, not just once, a few times when I've been speaking at a university, I've had a fellow scientist come up to me afterwards and say, I've been trying so hard to reach out to our local faith communities, and I just can't get my foot in the door. What would you recommend? And each time I say, well, why don't you start with the community that's closest to you? You know, what church or place of worship, or, you know, where do you attend? And each time they say, oh, I don't go anywhere. I'm an atheist. And so I say, okay, stop. That's not the right place for you to be starting then. You should start somewhere that you are genuinely engaged and involved in. And each time they're like, well, I like science. And I say, of course you do. I'm a scientist too. I love science too. But what else do you do? And so talking through them, like with one man, as I tell about in the book, eventually he said, well, I'm a diver. Sort of, you know, as if it didn't matter too much. I'm like, oh, tell me more. He said, well, actually, I dive quite a bit and I have a record from some very deep dives. And I said, well, that's perfect. The diving community needs to know about climate change. The ocean is changing massively, even more than here on land. 90% of the heat being trapped by this blanket we're wrapping around the planet, made of heat-trapping gases, it's going into the ocean. So contact your local PADI certification programs, contact local diving schools, offer to tell them about how climate change is affecting what they will see with their own eyes in the ocean, and maybe there's some citizen science programs that they could be part of as they dive.
It's such a great story too, because that a scientist hadn't put it together with diving and oceans and the warming of oceans. I mean, it's so wonderful. It gives us all hope that maybe if we think a little harder, we can figure out our place in this. There's a couple really good questions still in there. We are out of time. I'm so sorry to say, but thanks to everyone that tuned in live. And as a reminder, the live stream conversation will also be available for playback on the council's social channels and website shortly. But Katharine, thank you for leading us through this really dynamic and timely conversation. And we could probably do a whole nother hour on many different pieces of it. And I hope that we get the opportunity to hear from you again. But thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. And ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned.